This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to episode 204 of a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda, and today's episode is brought to you by Live at Manning Conferences from Manning Publications. And this conference is coming up on June 15th, 2021, starting at noon Eastern Time, live on Twitch. Is about developer productivity. We all know that time is that one asset that you can never get back. So once you've lost your time, once time is gone, once you've spent too much time doing something you shouldn't have done, you've lost it and you can't get that back. So what this conference is going to be about is how to get a real boost in your efficiency. We're going to talk or listen to developers and other speakers talk about good coding practices, effective development methodologies, and some amazing automation tools. I'm super excited about this one, and you can find out more by going to geekleader.com/productivity. Again, that's geekleader.com/productivity for the Live at Manning Conference on Developer Productivity. It'll be June 15th, 2021. Again, at geekleader.com/productivity. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, I have Michelle Natalya Moore. She's the founder of MindEQuity Management Consultant, and they do some really cool stuff when it comes to helping teams become more successful, increase performance. And we're going to talk today, hopefully, about distractions and focus and how to get your team working on the right things. So, Michelle, with all that being said, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about how you got to where you are today and why you are focusing on the things that you're focusing on.
Sure. So I've always worked at the intersection of people and technology. And I grew up in Houston, Texas. And being in Houston, I actually grew up right behind Mission Control, right behind NASA. So one of my first jobs and the way I actually financed my MBA at the University of Houston was I was working in the marketing arm of a company selling declassified space technology for various organizations all over the world. And I got hired to manage a science exhibition of space technology and got to, meet a lot of astronauts, cosmonauts. And then when I moved into graduate school, I worked at MTV, music television. Mm-hmm. And I actually worked at MTV overseas. So I was also in that television tech space, right? So it started out with space technology, and I was not a techie. I was a project manager and also did sales of some of this declassified space tech for science museums. Then it was television. And then when I finished my MBA, I decided to go into consulting. And frankly, that's what you do when you don't know what you want to do. And it turned out to be a really good choice. So I continued on the tech front. So I joined Pricewaterhouse at the time. And the big thing was SAP. SAP had just come on the market. So I was one of these groups or practices that first got trained on how to configure and implement different modules of SAP. So SAP implementation, that morphed into e-procurement. And the whole while, although I did configure systems a bit, I was never on the back end side, but I was always most interested in tech-driven change from a people standpoint. Mm-hmm. And that also morphed into the way I made partner at PwC. My partner business case was based on that I created the first cybersecurity practice or IT risk management practice in Moscow, in Russia. And I ended up there for 15 years and worked with a bunch of ethical hackers. Mm. So I came to Canada 11 years ago now, and have been working more in the social impact space with leading a tech company that provides technology services to philanthropic foundations. And now I run my own social enterprise around focusing better, helping professional teams, professional services teams, including in particular technology teams, focus better so that they can continue to innovate without suffering from this lack of well-being that we especially probably are suffering from in this pandemic.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely a lack of well-being partly because of the pandemic and partly because of I don't know, if for me, it's the stress of not knowing what's next, and, you always think like, what's, are we going to get back to normal? What is normal now? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that.
One of the things I coach my clients on is a practice of becoming comfortable with uncertainty. It's actually a practice that allows one to also get into the present moment and focus on the important tasks we're doing right now that are in front of us. Because when we go into that spiral of, I don't know what's going to happen, that is a distraction in and of itself. So, this concept of leaning into uncertainty and becoming friends with it is a really new concept for me. Probably I learned about it maybe a year or two ago only. And I find it fascinating and a little bit nebulous.
Yeah, I think one of the things I always tell my team that they need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And that whenever you find something that you don't like doing, it's probably the thing you need to do the most. Like for me, if I think back about exercise, I don't like to work on legs, but I should probably work on legs the most because I don't like to do it.
That's a really good point. Very good point.
So one of the things I do want to talk about, because I run into this all the time with myself and people that I manage and lead, is the ability to focus on the right things and not get distracted by, like you were talking about, being the present moment and not think about the things that are around you and get distracted by other things. Like for me, just today, I was thinking, oh, well, I don't have kids baseball today. So what am I going to do when I get home? And I started thinking about that versus, what I was doing at the moment this morning. And I should probably be focusing on what I'm working on, not worrying about what I'm going to do at home, because now this is the first free evening we've had in, a few weeks. So what are we going to do? You know?
Yeah, that's a great start. I feel like there are more layers to this. So one
Mm.
layer is, when do I need to have undistracted focused work time, and when is it okay to be doing a little bit of task switching or reactive work? So if I'm allowed to quote Cal Newport, who I really admire, his book Deep Work talks about this difference between deep work, which is that undistracted, focused work that creates new value or that is hard to replicate or that's teaching us new skills, versus logistical work or more transactional work, which is also important in many of our roles. And what I found most interesting is that when we ask ourselves, well, how much undistracted, focused, deep work time do I actually need per day? We might tend to say, oh, I wish I had 8 hours of that kind of work, but the brain can't handle it. The brain can do between 2 and 4 hours of deep work a day. So knowing that constraint and knowing that, okay, my day is going to have this balance based on my role, my specific role is going to have this balance, and it's different for everyone, right? Between distracted work time and focused work time. And we need both are great, right? One is not worse than the other. And so then we look at, okay, well, what tasks that I have to do in my role that really create the highest value, which of those tasks really should be done in that focused work environment? So if I know that, then I can start to block time when it's possible from a team standpoint or from an environment standpoint, when my kids are at school, for example, to do that. So
Mm.
those are the layers I see.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. And I know for me, like one of the things that I do is I put a block on my calendar of about 2 hours that I used to call it strategy meetings, but it wasn't meeting with anybody. It was just myself. It was a strategy meeting with myself. Now I call them project work. But that's what it is. It's a time where my Microsoft Teams goes to unavailable. I'm not to be disturbed. My phone is muted, and I'm going to focus in on whatever it is I need to focus in on that day. And at that point, I'm drilling in, and 2 hours a day is about the max that I can handle. So I book 2 hours, and I try to stick to that.
You are modeling a best practice. Absolutely. Not many people are doing that. How many members of your team actually copy that great behavior that you're modeling?
Very few. I've suggested it, but most people don't do it because most people, they have this fear of I don't know if it's a fear of being left out or missing out or what it is, but you'll talk to them like, well, I feel like I need to be available just in case. And I'm like, well, What happens if you're not here that day? What happens if you're sick? Or is the whole company going to fall apart? No, we'll be fine. We'll be fine if you're busy for 2 hours and people can't get in touch with you. I'm your boss. I tell you it's okay. And they still, like, people just still don't do it. And I don't know why. It happened at my last company too, where I was managing a team of web and mobile developers. And I asked everybody to spend to do 20% of their time for the entire week, to block it off to where people can't message them, people can't work with them. And I got this from a book called I think it was Todd Henry's book, The Accidental Creative, where he talked about how you needed to focus time on certain, or maybe it was his other book was Die Empty. Yeah, it's Die Empty, where he's talking about you needed to focus time on certain things to do the important stuff and not leave that on the table. And when you're distracted all the time, you're leaving that work on the table. And I asked people to do it, but I found that they just wouldn't do it, or they would do it for a week or two and then get back to the old routine of just being available. And, that's another thing that I do is I shut my door, my office back, before COVID, when people would come into people's offices, I would always shut my door and say, my door is always open unless it's not. And if it's not, it's not. And during that 2-hour block, I would shut my door, and it's just not open. Then you have to wait.
So that's great that as a leader, you're modeling that behavior, and it brings up the point of culture and behavior and unwritten agreements or even written policies. And so I think what I coach my clients to do is to have the whole team get together and have an open dialogue about what are our current unwritten agreements, or what are my fears of missing out by not blocking time on my calendar, and how can we support each other if that's what we collectively want and feel is valuable. How can we support each other in actually putting together a written agreement, a collaborative, co-created agreement that says, hey, we're allowed to do this. And we recognize this is not only going to increase, it's going to let us work fewer hours, first of all. We're not going to reprimand each other for doing this. Our boss does it, so we know it's okay. But how can we hold space for each other in the team to do it? And that process of coming together on a very simple agreement like this on behavior could potentially help.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. It's one of those things where, like, I feel like the culture needs to change at most places. I know when I first got to the company that I'm at now, when I would send out an email, because sometimes in the evenings I'll pull up the laptop, check work, which I know I probably shouldn't do, but I'll check work and I'll shoot out some emails, and people would respond right away. And I wasn't used to that, because at my last job, I had told people, you don't have to respond to me if it's after hours. When you're home and you're not working, and that's okay. But then here it was just like, I would immediately get a response back. So I had to try to set myself limits of don't send emails, just put them to your drafts. Don't send the actual email in the evening, because people have this tendency of feeling like, oh, I need to respond to the new boss. He sent me a message. I need to get back to him right away. And I need to figure out how to change that culture a little bit to where, if it's urgent, I can pick up the phone and call you, an email isn't urgent.
Yeah, that gets to this topic of one of the mistakes I see leaders make is not having clear direction on instant response, right? So as human beings, we like instant response because of the dopamine hit.
Yeah.
And it makes us feel important. It makes us feel busy, which is not necessarily effective. Like we think busyness is productive time, but it's not really, it's more task switching. But this conversation then, or clarity around, well, internally, what requires an instant response, and externally, if we have external clients, what requires instant response, and having a clear definition and understanding, and making the business case for people that, look, if we cut down on some of this instant response that's not necessary, let's define when it's necessary and when it's not necessary, we can actually work less, work fewer hours, do better work, have higher well-being, and everybody's just going to be better workers.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And, this came to life for me when I was my first time managing, and I was managing a web team, and one of my star employees, and I think a lot of new managers probably do this too. We kind of lean on our senior team members, our what we call our star employees, our rock stars. We lean on them probably more than we should. And there was a guy that I leaned on all the time. If I had something that came up and, I needed some information or I needed something done, I always went to him. And during one of our I didn't know about one-on-ones. I didn't know about really anything when it came to management. But during one of our meetings, we were talking, and he was really frustrated. And I said, what's bothering you? He's like, I don't want to say. I said, you can tell me anything. I want to know. And he finally said, okay. So what's bothering me is the fact that every time I get in a rhythm of starting to do something, starting to code, I get hit up with a distraction from you about needing something, needing this, needing that. And I said, I don't really do it that often. And then I went back and checked, and it was literally like 4 or 5 times a day. I would ping him, asking him for something, or can you get me this? Can you get me that? And that triggered something in my mind. Said, what if I just wait? I don't need all this stuff today. I'll just wait. And then once a day in the morning, I'll say, here's all the things that I've built up from yesterday. And like, here are the 5 things I need from you when you have time. And just that way I interrupt him one time instead of 4 or 5 times. And I can leave him alone to do his job.
I love that approach, John. It really demonstrates the degree of self-awareness we constantly have to cultivate as people, as humans, and as leaders in particular, so that we stop ourselves in the track and also help others develop self-awareness about how they behave. It's interesting when I ask teams, how much time do you think you're spending in a day or in a week on task switching, or how much time do you think you lose? And teams will answer, whatever, how many number of hours. But then when they go and actually track it, they find that it's double. So people have a false sense, and this is not a bad thing. It's just, as humans, we don't know unless we track, of how much they're doing a particular behavior until they actually sit down and try to measure it.
Okay, help me out here. How can I measure that? How can I measure that for my team?
So in your example, you did start measuring it because you started to record on paper or in some electronic means how often you were pinging this senior person for something, right? So you started to document it when you realized, or when he made you aware, hey, you keep pinging me during the day and you didn't think you were doing that much. So the other way you can track it is by using any time tracking apps. But I think using a piece of paper is actually quite easy. Just kind of at the half day or at the end of the day, just note in general, how was I spending my day? And in particular, if someone makes you aware that you're doing something, like you're constantly in a particular Slack channel or a Teams channel or whatever, and you're constantly responding, a team member, if you guys have this discussion, say, oh, can we observe each other and how we're interacting in channels, right? And our team members might be really give valuable insight and say, hey, well, I noticed in this channel, you're constantly just responding yes or no. You seem to be in there, but maybe you don't need to be, maybe it's not super important or whatever, right? We might begin to make our team members aware of behavior, and then we can start to track, oh, am I doing that? If it's just time tracking, there are time tracking apps, Pomodoro or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with those. I've used Pomodoro Method for a while. And that was helpful, especially for like developers, where I would have them, I had my whole team do it, use the Pomodoro Method, code for 25 minutes, and then open up Slack and check what messages you missed, and turn off email. And turn off email was like a big one for me. Was just, I used to always come in the first thing in the morning is check all my emails. And that was such a distraction because I would have like, here's what I'm gonna do today. And then I would open an email and it would totally train wreck my day. Whereas if I just waited like 2 hours and then check that email, I could get like a lot of what I wanted to get done before, the train wreck started.
Yeah, and there's the whole notion of life without email. And, but we got all excited when we moved into, instant messaging channels like in Slack or Teams, but that's also become overwhelming. So that helped some companies get out of email and they moved into Slack for internal communications. And that reduced some of that email backlog. But then, I had a client this morning say to me, Michelle, we've got Slack on crack. What do we do?
Yeah.
Which I thought was just a very a strong way to describe the tension in the team around Slack channels.
Yeah, I ended up taking myself. I'm still in the channels, but I don't get notifications for anything unless it's a direct message to me. Just because those notifications were driving me crazy. Like I can go back later when I have some free time to read things, but when I'm focusing, I need to focus. So what are things? I know we talked about task switching a little bit and how that wastes or consumes time that probably if they plan their day more accordingly and wasn't distracted by things coming in and out, you can be more effective. What about work in progress? Having too much work in progress, how does that affect maybe the way our mind operates and handles some of these things?
Yeah, so it again comes down to what I call the value creation portfolio.
Hmm.
So if we as an employee know what are my value creation activities, how is value defined other than money, right? How is value defined for my role or for my team or for my company? And so that's kind of the first step, is knowing what value creation means, and then knowing which tasks that are on my portfolio of work are actually these value creation tasks. And then looking at that, doing a current state kind of map of that portfolio, much like an investment portfolio, categorizing what's value creation activities and what are more logistical activities. And then we understand, do I have too much on my plate? So sometimes it's an issue of someone has too much on their plate and that needs to be rebalanced among other team members. That's one. And then sometimes the balance of that portfolio between value creation activities and logistical activities is uneven and needs to be recalibrated. So that is really the first step, is understanding the value creation portfolio in the current state, in order then to say, okay, well, what could the future state be to make me more effective and also not work so much overtime, for example.
Hmm.
And then understanding what cultural or mindset shifts or policy shifts need to be put in place. Where do I need help from my team or my leader to make this happen? So it's a complex, layered activity to get to the right answer.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I know for me, it goes into like a leadership task and problem that I run into, where I want people to be productive. I want them to feel productive. And when I limit the things that I want them working on, sometimes they feel, or they come to me and tell me that they feel less productive because they were taken off of something, or something was removed from their plate. How do I balance that effort? How do I communicate that in a way that's, I don't want to tell them they're doing a bad job, because they're getting things done. They're doing a good job, but I could see, I could increase the value that they contribute if I can take these two things away and give you something, and give you just one thing instead of two.
Yeah, so I think the first challenge is with this word productive or productivity,
Mm,
because it depends on how is that being measured. And I really like the idea of moving away from productivity and instead measuring effectiveness, getting the right things done. Because measuring effectiveness gets more to, how am I creating value? And people can really feel proud of the value they're creating when they see that it's aligned with, hopefully, also their own personal purpose, which they have at work in the work context, which sometimes is aligned with personal purpose as well.
mhm.
But if we look at, okay, I'm doing this role, I'm in this career because this energizes me and I see how I create value. And I know that my company values X work. And so, what does it mean to be effective in this role rather than productive? Because productive is just output over input, right? Or input over output, rather. And effectiveness is doing the right things in a quality way. One example of that is, I think I read that Google measures lines of code. Well, lines of code is kind of productivity. They're
Mhm.
not, if they could change to measuring, people might feel better about their work if they were measured on, well, what did these lines of code contribute to in terms of an impact for a client or a social impact or for creating something cool. And so that to me is an opportunity to think about productivity and effectiveness, or think more about effectiveness rather than productivity.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right, because, I can write 10,000 lines of code, but if they don't do a whole lot, it's not, it's not that effective, right? And,
Exactly.
and the best developers, they would take, 5,000 lines of code and write it in 50. Um,
Yeah, I've
so,
also heard developers say that coding can be beautiful, like
mhm.
it's almost like art. And so when they write beautiful code, they know it's good because it has some sort of beauty to it. And they're artists in a way, right? And that can really make people feel that they're in flow and creating value. And then they'll really see that you taking away some of these minor tasks in order to focus on the more important things I think then they might feel less tension about letting go of some of those things.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think that might be helpful for sure. Um, so another question that I have when it comes to balancing like workload and work in progress and distractions come to when your role is split among maybe support and service as well as projects and projects that you have to do to complete on a certain time. How do you balance the ability to get the project done and stay on track versus the noisy distractions that come from someone that's having issues? Let's say they can't send an email to somebody or something's not working the way they thought it would. And, I need to know how to use SharePoint. I don't know. I'm just throwing out a bunch of examples, but how do you balance that distraction that comes from support when you also have projects that you have to work on too?
Yeah, I love that question, John, because in all of the technology services teams that I've, had experience with, this is an issue. And people generally, again, it's the same thing about what is my role and what percentage of my role is about support versus projects.
Mhm.
And it gets back to that value creation portfolio again. So if I have a project, generally the deadlines are fixed and they're known. So one knows what one's working towards. And then on the side, you have the support calls coming in. And some of those could be really, really urgent. And so they need to be defined as urgent. And some of them might be less urgent. And so if we're clear on that, which many professional teams are already, then the question is, okay, can I carve out 2 hours a day for my project work? And can we have clear shifts on when people are doing the support response, the really reactive response where we need to be doing immediate response to serve our clients? Is that work designed in such a way that the task switching is minimized? Does
Hmm.
that make sense? So I don't know how well work sometimes in teams is designed if people have these dual roles, but they could switch on alternate days to be, okay, I answer support calls only in this time frame, not all day long, so that I have blocked time in my calendar to get the project work done. And then
Yeah.
the other question, of course, is there too much on my plate? Do I have too many projects plus the support work or not?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point because projects, in roles where I've led projects typically are always going to be there, right? They might not be the same projects, some might be bigger than others, but yeah, if you could allocate 50% of your time to project work and 50% to support work and have that scheduled so that you know, Tuesdays and Thursdays and the first half of the day on Friday are going to be support times, and Mondays, Wednesdays, and the second half of the day on Friday are going to be my project time. That would make a whole lot of sense and preventing that task switching and having to, oh, what was I working on this project before I got that phone call? Let me go figure that out. Oh, I just got another call. I got to switch back.
And especially if that project is like an implementation and you're about to go live. Well,
Yeah.
during go live, you want to delegate your support work to somebody else or say, can I block my time? We have go live today or this week and take me off of support. So I
Mhm.
don't have to be reactive and don't get interrupted when I'm trying to do go live, right?
Yeah, for sure. One thing, so I teach part-time at Winthrop University. And when I'm thinking about like balancing time and things like that, I go back to one of the assignments that I have my senior level information design students do is to I have the spreadsheet template that I give them to track their time for 24 hours a day for an entire week. And I have them do that at the beginning of the semester and then at the end of the semester to kind of compare and see where their time's really going. Because for me, and I do it myself too, because I realize that my time, I have no clue where it goes sometimes, but when you can go back and look and say, oh my gosh, I spent, 4 hours playing video games or watching Netflix or whatever, it can really trigger your mind into thinking that I need to do better at these things. I say health is important, but I only spent an hour last week working out, and yet I spent 4 hours, playing video games or something like that. What kind of activities do you think are helpful, and how often should people do things to keep track and understand where time and things are going?
So I think it's important to do it regularly, especially because time is the only resource. If we've lost it, we just can't get it back. I mean, you could
Mhm.
argue that about health too, but time is sort of something when it's gone, it's gone. And it gets into this question of essentialism. I think you had someone on another podcast wrote
Yeah.
a book about essentialism, right? So it gets
Mhm.
to this essentialism question, especially if you're looking at the 24-hour workday. But I put my work right now in the context of, how do we know we need to focus better? How do we change how we're spending our time? And I really believe that the attention economy is detrimental to us. I mean, we know from the work that the Center for Humane Technology is doing that Facebook and Instagram and all these other Silicon Valley business models are making money because they are taking our attention. And we are willingly giving our attention to those time sucking activities on those platforms because it's for free and because we get dopamine hits. So if we
Mhm.
can become aware of this, I think as humanity, we have two existential threats. One existential threat is climate change, but I think the second existential threat is that machines are going to become our masters. And are we still the masters of our tools today, right? When you look at the research that Center for Humane Tech is doing, you can see the trend where we as humans are going. We are relinquishing our power and our attention more and more to tools. So if we can kind of think of that in that bigger, maybe that's too much of a scary concept, but it's real, right? And if we don't know how we're spending our time, and if we're not intentional about Facebook use or whatnot, we just risk harming ourselves and harming our future. Um, so that to me incentivizes me to look at, how am I spending my day? Am I spending it the way I want to spend it as a human being? Or am I giving over my power to some tech tool, platform, or device?
Yeah, I think it was Elon Musk that said one time that humans are just the biological bootloader for artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's a great quote. Exactly.
And that is so scary to think about, you know?
It's very scary. I mean, I personally boycott Facebook and Instagram. I
Good.
personally only engage on LinkedIn, and and that's a recent decision that I've made in the last year. So until these business models change, I think it's going to be a big challenge for all of us.
I think that's a I watched that documentary on Netflix, I think it's called The Social Dilemma.
Yes.
Um, and it's one of those things where you know that's happening, but you don't know it's happening at the same time. And I think when you see something like that, it's really eye opening. And I'm definitely concerned about the future generations when it comes to social media and time management. Because I grew up, I didn't have a cell phone, I didn't have Instagram or Facebook or any of that stuff. Growing up, not even until I was out of college, really. So it's one of those things where now you see kids, you see had some relatives in town, and their kids were on their phone constantly, and it's just one of those things you think about, like how how is this going to affect, or how is life going to be different 50 years from now
Well,
if
it's
this is
scary.
happening?
Yeah, it's scary because the research that I've seen in the recent year is about the prefrontal cortex switch, not switching because of task switching and notifications that cause task switching. Our prefrontal cortex is shrinking. And also, the University of Texas in Austin, where I went to school, published something about a year and a half ago that showed that even if we have a smartphone in off position or on silent, face down on our desk or
Mhm.
at dinner, it's still reducing our cognition by 50%.
Wow.
So that's so hard to believe because we can't see it. So, I feel like tech distraction and the impact, the negative impact it's having on the development of our brains, also to me is especially kids, right? If you see, like you described, the children on their devices, if people aren't aware how much that's harming brain development in children in particular, then they are less inclined to do something about it. So that to me is a really scary point. Let's get the kids more out in nature. Let's do more gameplay. That's not a video game. Let's do more sport that doesn't require any digital tool. And the other thing I think is interesting, right? One of the reasons the whole world is so challenged by harnessing in this terrible pandemic is because we can't see COVID. We can't see it. Imagine if we could see all of those droplets that come out of our mouths and land on other people, and we could see droplets that were COVID and they were red, bright red. Well, we'd be running away from crowds. We wouldn't be arguing about masks. We'd be scared to death, right? And same thing with tech. We can't see it. We can't see the damage it's doing to our brains and to our well-being. We only feel the impact of it after several years of going down, excessive use of it. So that to me is a big human challenge. When you can't see it, you're really not that worried about it.
I think you're absolutely right. And I know I can see in my kids when they have their iPad for an extended period of time, like whether we're going on a trip or, because get them in the car, whatever, their attitudes totally change. And it becomes like they're not fun to be around anymore, which is one of the things that my wife and I do is we have, our kids are in sports. They play all of the sports they can play right now: soccer, softball, baseball, basketball, whatever they can do at their age range, they're going to play the sports. And that's good because every night of the week, basically we have something to do. Either we're all packing up and we're going to our daughter's game, we're all packing up going to one of our son's games, we're all going somewhere and doing something. And there's no electronics during that period. There's also no electronics until chores are done, until everything's done. And then maybe at the end of the night, after all homework and everything's done, and after dinner, you might have 30 minutes of electronics before bedtime. And even then it's like, do electronics, and then we'll play a game or read a book and then go to bed. And then we've also isolated, Sundays are no electronics days. So Sundays are days that we're not going to pull out the iPad. We're not going to play or play on those. We're going to play in real life with real games and outside and go on hikes and explore the neighborhood or do whatever, but we're not going to have iPads on Sundays. And I found that just that little bit of freeing the mind away from those distractions have made a huge impact in kids. And I think they do for us adults too. I know you've talked about slack on crack, but yeah, sometimes that is the case, and we need to get rid of these electronic communications sometimes in order to focus on other tasks.
John, hearing that you do those things, those healthy behaviors with your family, just makes me so happy. Can you imagine if all parents did that? Just imagine how much better off we'd be right now. It's amazing.
Yeah, and in all honesty, I got to throw this out there too. So the other day, our daycare was closed because of something, and our 3-year-old was home, and we had to try to work with the 3-year-old being there. There was a lot of iPad day that time. So it's not always perfect.
Intentional, right? That's okay. It's intentional. I mean, this year I hosted the first Canadian National Day of Unplugging. And this National Day of Unplugging has been a movement in the United States for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And it happens every March, and a huge collective, thousands of people turn off their devices at 6 p.m. on a Friday night and don't turn them on again until 6 p.m. on the Saturday night. So we did this in Canada, ceremoniously, signed off, and in prep for this shared a lot of ideas about what were we going to do these 24 hours. Of course, in those 24 hours, 8 of them is sleeping. So it's really only 16 hours and you commit to not watching TV, not talking on a smartphone. If you need to talk to somebody, you talk on a landline, and you just agree to not have any screens, right? And sharing ideas about, what to do. And it's just, people were so happy to share with each other the book they plan to read, or how they plan to have a mindful meal and just have great conversation, and how it dragged out and they had great wine and great, dialogue without their devices or without watching the news at the same time. And the recommendation, again, from the Center for Humane Technology is that we should be disconnecting 24 hours a week. Now, I'm striving right now to do 24 hours a month. Mm-hmm. So doing this day of unplugging once a month. But if we could work up to 1 day a week, I think we would be a lot healthier.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's one of those things where I go back to when I was in, I guess it was in college, and cell phones were becoming popular. And my dad he hated cell phones. He hated phones. He hated answering machines. And I remember even being in high school, my dad didn't want us to get an answer machine. And I was like, Dad, we have to have an answer machine. What if we're not home? He's like, well, if we're not home, we're not home. They just call us back. It's not a big deal. And it blew my mind that we couldn't have an answering machine. But I think you might have been onto something.
Yeah, sounds like my dad. We
So,
had the same
what
thing.
are some ways that we, as leaders of teams in tech, can can use some of the information that we know about tech to maybe make our teams more productive without going down these negative rabbit holes?
Well, you talked about the first important thing that you do as a leader yourself, which is having this self awareness and modeling these behaviors. In addition to that, of course, we need the culture around us in our teams to support us so that we don't have fear of missing out. Or, in COVID, there was an article I read recently too that fear of job loss is up. And
Mm.
so that is also causing people to stay online longer and be present and in the eye of the leader or whatever, just because of fear. So as a leader, if we can reduce the amount of fear, especially now, that is associated with excessive participation, maybe when it's not even needed, or excessive overtime when it's not even needed. That is something we can do to hold a safe space for people to feel comfortable that, yes, it's okay to turn off. The other one, of course, is knowing this value creation portfolio. Or a simple one that we haven't talked about is, we have Zoom fatigue, right?
Mhm.
Most of us have Zoom fatigue. And considering which of the meetings or one-on-one conversations could we do via a walk and talk, where we're just talking to each other on a cell phone while we're taking a walk in nature, if we're having a check-in one-on-one with our boss. So what can we move from a Zoom, screen in our face or faces in our screens meeting to an actual phone call? And a lot of teams are also going to conference calls now so that people don't have to have their face in a screen as much. So maybe redesigning or rethinking number of meetings, length of meetings, and which ones could we possibly move to audio, or when we get out of COVID, obviously, into a physical space instead. Because it's draining to be on Zoom,
Yeah.
more draining than it is to be in a physical meeting. Because also the other thing as a leader we can do is share some of this data about the brain, the prefrontal cortex shrinking or cognition going down by 50%. Or why do we have brain fatigue after Zoom? It's because if we're on a Zoom with more than two people, three or more people, the brain, the eye has to dart between faces. It doesn't know what to focus on, especially when you've got like 16 people on a screen in
Mhm.
the Zoom gallery, right? And the brain gets tired because it's constantly trying to figure out which of these boxes, which of these faces do I focus on? And that's why we have Zoom fatigue, because the eye doesn't know how to deal with so many faces on a screen.
Yeah, I found that not only the walking one-on-ones they're extremely helpful for many different ways. One thing, you're getting outside, you're getting some vitamin D, you're getting some sun, you're enjoying nature a little bit, but it also levels the playing field. So as a boss, sometimes you have someone come into your office to do a one-on-one and it's awkward. It's kind of strange. They're in your territory now or whatever. But when you go out and you walk, you're kind of on more of an equal footing. And I found that people are more likely to open up and share the negative things that you need to hear that you don't want to hear or that they don't want to say when you're outside walking. And it seems like a more personal way to connect. And also, I think it's a pretty safe now. If people are back in the office, as long as you're out in nature and you can keep that social distance.
Yeah, the other thing that's so good about that from a physiological standpoint is when we get back in our bodies, i.e., walking in nature, we're connected back to earth and we're getting a bit out of our heads. So empathy increases. We have better listening skills because we're more calm in a natural environment, or even when the body is simply moving. When we're in movement, we are balancing that body mind connection, we're de-stressing. So, from a well being standpoint, from a listening standpoint, from a how do I connect with this human being in this conversation standpoint, it's just super valuable.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree 100%. I think I think getting out and just having those disconnects. That's another thing. Like when you're in an office with someone and having a meeting, or even if you're on Zoom with someone, you can kind of tell if they're not paying attention, if they're doing something else. And it's so distracting to think that, okay, we're having a call right now, but I can hear you typing to something totally unrelated to what we're talking about. Or I can hear you, or I can see that your eyes aren't looking, where you think they should be for this meeting. Or even if you can't see or hear anything, there's just those awkward pauses where, did they hear what I said? Are they paying attention? And getting away from those distractions, getting outside, or just going somewhere where you don't have that distraction, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, the other question is, what agreement do we have
Mhm.
around cameras on in a virtual meeting versus cameras off? And if there's an agreement for everybody to have cameras on, we can also openly have an agreement about, hey, how prepared is everyone to commit to being here in this meeting today? Everyone here is valued in this meeting. That's why you're invited to it. Can we all commit to not doing emails at the same time?
Yeah.
And just having those conversations, reminding people, if we talk about it, if we bring it out into the open, then the likelihood that someone is going to participate in a more present way just goes way up.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think having those conversations, and like you said, setting the expectations and the agreements of how we're going to handle things and how we're going to move forward is very important.
Another cool thing that happens in some organizations is this concept of the check in and the check out.
Hmm.
And the check in and the check out is more of a personal thing. How are you arriving is the question. And people can be free to answer, oh, I'm arriving in a really tired state, honestly. I just want to put that out there. And it's not a discussion. No one responds, right? People just share whatever they want to share. Maybe I have a newborn in the house and I didn't sleep all night and I just want to share that I'm arriving tired. And then someone else might check in a different way. And then checking out at the end of the meeting, well, how are you checking out? How are you feeling now? And it can be super short, limited to one sentence and no dialogue. And this is an interesting technique that I see organizations here in Canada using.
And how do people, you said there's no dialogue, so there's no response, but how does that change the way someone communicates?
So it can feel vulnerable,
Mhm.
but people feel listened to. They
Mm.
feel held. This idea of holding space for someone just to articulate whatever it is they want to share. And some people share more personal, more emotional things. Some people do not, right? And no one is required to do one or the other. It's whatever that person feels like sharing in the moment. Yeah. And people feel like they're heard.
Yeah, and I imagine if you are one of those people that rarely shares, and then when you do, it's going to mean probably a little bit more coming from something like that. Like if you like if it were me, I don't share a whole lot. I come in. I'm I guess really lucky that I come in pretty level most of the time. I'm not usually in a bad mood or a good mood. I'm kind of just level. But if I came in and said, "Man, I'm exhausted," then people will probably like, "Oh, well, that's unusual," and handle that differently. Is that something you see?
Absolutely. And just think about how people would appreciate also hearing that, wow, my boss also gets exhausted sometimes. It's useful to hear that, right?
Mhm.
For others. And it just reminds us that we all are kind of in a different state every day and in a different state in our lives. And if we can know that about each other, we create more respect, we create more empathy, it improves collaboration, and it kind of just settles us at the beginning and at the end of the meeting as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, Michelle, this has been a great conversation. How can people find out more about the work you're doing and connect with you?
Yeah, so the easiest way is to go to my website at mindequity.ca for Canada. So that's mind, MIND, equity, like an equity investment. And I have a free tool right now on that website. There's a green score your focus button.
Hmm.
So you can do a quick, in less than 2 minutes, current state assessment on how well are you able today to harness and protect your attention? What's your state of focus? So I welcome anyone who wants to do a quick self-assessment to just click on the green button at mindequity.ca.
Now, I'm nervous on how that's going to score.
You get your score right away. It's just information, right? It's just self-awareness. And yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I want to link that up as well as your LinkedIn and to the show notes at geekleader.com. People can click through and get that information. Michelle, again, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure. Have a good week.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some t-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.